The candles in the chapel burned low, as Eleanor Hale stood before the altar, her hand trembling inside the hand of a man she had met only twice before this day. Duke Alistair Renwick did not look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the stone floor, as the priest spoke the final words of the marriage rite. When the priest asked him to speak his vow, silence stretched through the chapel for 3 long seconds before he finally said the words in a flat, distant voice, as though he were reading them from a page rather than feeling them in his heart. Eleanor felt the cold press of his fingers and wondered if any warmth lived inside this man at all. She had come to Ashcombe Hall with hope folded carefully inside her chest, the kind of hope a young woman carries when she does not yet know how heavy a house full of secrets can be. Her father, Walter Hale, a merchant who had built his fortune through trade routes and careful bargains, had arranged this match to save the Duke's crumbling estate and to lift his own family into the ranks of nobility. Eleanor had agreed to the marriage without complaint, believing that duty and kindness might grow into something more, given enough time and patience. She was wrong about how quickly her patience would be tested. The wedding feast that followed was quiet and stiff. Guests whispered behind painted fans, their eyes darting toward the Duke and his new bride with open curiosity. Some pitied her. Others seemed almost amused, as though they knew something she did not. Margaret Whitmore, Eleanor's closest friend since childhood, sat near her at the long table and squeezed her hand under the cloth. "He has not said 10 words to you all evening," Margaret whispered. "He is a quiet man," Eleanor answered, though she did not believe her own words. When the feast ended, servants led Eleanor up a wide staircase to the chamber that would now be hers, a room with heavy curtains and cold stone walls, despite the fire burning in the hearth. She waited there in her wedding dress, her heart beating fast with a mixture of nerves and hope, listening to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The door opened, and Alistair entered. He was tall, with dark hair, and eyes the color of a stormy sea, features that might have been called handsome if they were not so guarded. He closed the door behind him and stood near it, keeping his distance, as though the room itself were dangerous. "Eleanor," he said, using her name for the first time that day, though he said it the way one might say the name of a stranger. "I must tell you something, and I ask that you hear me without interruption." She nodded, folding her hands in front of her, bracing herself without knowing exactly what she was bracing for. "This marriage exists because my father's will demanded it, and because your family's fortune is needed to save this estate from ruin," he said. "I will not pretend otherwise, but I must be honest with you now, before any false hope takes root between us. I cannot be a husband to you, not in the way a husband should be. This will be a marriage of names and papers, nothing more. You will have every comfort this house can offer. You will never want for anything material, but do not expect warmth from me, and do not expect love. I have none left to give." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through every part of Eleanor's body. She had prepared herself for many things, but not for this cold, complete rejection, delivered on the very night she had hoped might begin something gentle between them. "May I ask why?" she said, keeping her voice steady, though her chest ached. "No," he said, "you may not. It is not something I will explain, not tonight, not ever, if I can help it." He turned and left the room, before she could say another word, and Eleanor stood alone in her wedding dress, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of a marriage that had ended before it had truly begun. She did not cry that night, though she wanted to. She had learned long ago from her mother that tears rarely changed anything, and that a woman who wished to survive in a world built by men needed a spine of iron beneath her soft exterior. So instead of weeping, Eleanor sat by the fire until the flames burned down to embers, and she made herself a quiet promise. She would not beg for his affection. She would not chase a man who had already closed every door between them. But she would not simply disappear into the shadows of this house either. She would understand him, whether he wished it or not, because a woman who understood her circumstances was far more powerful than one who simply endured them. The next morning, she woke to find a maid named Lucy laying out her clothes for the day, moving quietly and carefully, as though the entire house had been trained to whisper rather than speak. "Good morning, my lady," Lucy said, her eyes flicking briefly toward Eleanor's face, searching for some sign of what had happened the night before. "Good morning," Eleanor replied, keeping her tone light. "Tell me, Lucy, does the Duke always rise so early?" He rises before the sun most days, my lady. He walks the grounds, then shuts himself in his study until noon. And in the evenings? Lucy hesitated, her hands pausing over the folded linen. In the evenings, my lady, he often goes to the old chapel on the eastern side of the grounds. He stays there long after dark. The chapel where we were married? No, my lady. A smaller one. Older. It has not been used for services in many years. Eleanor filed this piece of information away carefully, the way her father had taught her to file away details of a business deal, small pieces that meant little on their own, but might form a larger picture once enough of them were gathered. Over the following days, Eleanor began to explore Ashcombe Hall, partly out of curiosity, and partly because she had little else to occupy her time. The house was grand, but strangely empty in places, with entire wings closed off and covered in dust sheets. She noticed that the portraits along the main hallway stopped abruptly at a certain point, as though someone had removed several paintings and never replaced them. She noticed too that the staff grew tense whenever certain topics arose, particularly any mention of the Duke's late brother, or of a woman named Catherine, whose name seemed to hover just beneath the surface of every conversation, spoken only in careful, hushed tones. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens, Eleanor came upon the housekeeper, a stern, but not unkind woman, named Mrs. Pruitt, who had served the Renwick family for over 20 years. "Mrs. Pruitt," Eleanor said, falling into step beside her, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, my lady." "Who is Catherine?" Mrs. Pruitt's hands stilled on the basket of flowers she carried. For a moment, Eleanor thought she might refuse to answer entirely. "That is not a name spoken in this house, my lady," Mrs. Pruitt finally said. "Not since the tragedy. I would advise you not to speak it near the Duke, if you value his peace of mind." "What tragedy?" "It is not my place to say, my lady. Forgive me." And with that, Mrs. Pruitt hurried away, leaving Eleanor standing alone among the rose bushes, more curious than ever. That evening, Eleanor decided to test her courage. She waited until the house grew quiet, then wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and made her way toward the eastern grounds, following the path Lucy had described. The old chapel stood at the edge of a small grove of trees, its stone walls covered in ivy, its windows dark except for a single flickering light within. She approached slowly, careful not to make a sound, and peered through a gap in the door. Inside, Alistair knelt before a small stone marker set into the floor, his head bowed, a single candle burning beside him. Eleanor could not read the words carved into the stone from where she stood, but she did not need to. She understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that she was looking at a grave, and that whatever had happened to the woman buried beneath that stone had shaped every cold word Alistair had spoken to her on their wedding night. She stepped back from the door, before he could notice her, her heart pounding, and made her way back to the house in silence, her mind spinning with questions she did not yet know how to ask. Over dinner the following night, one of the few meals they shared in silence at opposite ends of a long table, Eleanor studied her husband carefully. He ate little, his eyes distant, his shoulders carrying a weight that seemed far too heavy for a man his age. She wondered how old grief could sit so visibly on a person, like a coat worn every day, until it became a part of the body itself. "The soup is very good tonight," she said, simply to break the silence. He looked up, surprised, as though he had forgotten she was capable of speech. "Yes," he said. "The cook has always had a talent for such things." It was a small exchange, nothing more than a few ordinary words about soup, but Eleanor noticed something shift in his expression, a brief flicker of something that might have been gratitude for the normalcy of the moment. She decided, in that instant, that she would keep offering him small, ordinary things, not affection he had already refused, not questions about his past that he clearly could not bear to answer, just small, human moments that asked nothing of him and gave him space to simply exist, without the burden of his grief pressing down on every word. Days turned into weeks. Eleanor settled into a rhythm at Ashcombe Hall, learning the names of every servant, walking the grounds each morning, reading in the library each afternoon, and sharing quiet, mostly silent dinners with her husband each evening. She did not push him. She did not demand explanations. But she watched, and she listened, and slowly, piece by piece, she began to gather the fragments of a story that no one in the house seemed willing to tell her directly. She learned, through careful conversations with Lucy and with an old gardener named Samuel, who had worked the grounds for decades, that the Duke had once been betrothed to a woman named Catherine Ashford, the daughter of a neighboring family, and that their wedding had been planned for the autumn, 3 years before Eleanor's own arrival at Ashcombe Hall. She learned that something had gone terribly wrong before that wedding could take place, though no one would tell her exactly what, only that Catherine had died, and that Alistair had not been the same man since. Eleanor began to understand that the cold rejection she had received on her wedding night was not truly about her at all. It was about a wound that had never properly healed, a grief so deep that Alistair had built an entire fortress of silence and distance around himself, simply to survive it. Understanding this did not erase the sting of his words, but it gave her something to work with, something more useful than despair. If his coldness came from grief rather than cruelty, then perhaps, given enough time and patience, that grief might soften enough to let a small amount of warmth back into the house. She did not know yet how right or how difficult that hope would prove to be. But as she sat by her window each night, watching the distant light of the old chapel flicker in the darkness, Eleanor Hale, now Duchess of Ashcombe in name if not in heart, made a quiet decision. She would stay. She would learn everything this house had to teach her, and she would find a way to reach the man behind the grief, even if it took every ounce of patience she possessed. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Ashcombe Hall, a tall, elegantly dressed man named Edmund Vale, who arrived unannounced and asked to speak with the Duke on a matter he described only as urgent business. Eleanor watched from the top of the staircase as Cobb, the butler, led the visitor into Alistair's study, and she noticed the tension that gripped every servant who passed through the hallway during his visit, as though the entire house held its breath until the stranger left. She did not yet know who Edmund Vale was, or what business could bring such visible unease to a household already so burdened with silence. But she filed this detail away with the others, sensing that it too would matter before long. Ashcombe Hall was a house full of locked doors and buried secrets, and Eleanor was only just beginning to find the keys. Edmund Vale did not stay long that first morning, but his visit left a mark on the household that lingered for days. Eleanor noticed that Alistair grew even quieter after the stranger's departure, his jaw tight during dinner, his eyes fixed on some point far beyond the walls of the dining room. She wanted to ask who Edmund Vale was and why his presence had unsettled the entire staff, but she remembered her promise to herself, the one about patience, and she held her tongue. Instead, she turned her attention to the daily rhythms of Ashcombe Hall, trying to build a life for herself within a marriage that offered so little warmth. She began assisting Mrs. Pruitt with small household matters, first out of boredom, then out of genuine interest. She learned how the accounts were kept, which suppliers provided the best wool for winter blankets, and how the tenant farmers on the estate struggled each year to pay their rents on time. She discovered, to her surprise, that she had a talent for organizing such things, a talent she had inherited from her father without ever realizing it. One afternoon, while reviewing the household ledgers with Mrs. Pruitt, Eleanor noticed a strange pattern in the accounts. A significant sum of money left the estate every quarter, sent to an address in a nearby town, with no explanation attached beyond a single word written in the margin: settlement. Mrs. Pruitt, Eleanor said carefully, what is this payment made each quarter to an address in Thornfield? The housekeeper's face grew pale, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she might refuse to answer, just as she had done before when asked about Catherine. That is a matter for the Duke to discuss, my lady, not for me. Does it concern Catherine Ashford? Mrs. Pruitt's hands trembled slightly as she closed the ledger. Please, my lady, I beg you not to press me on this. It is not my place, and it would bring the Duke great pain to know we had spoken of it. Eleanor let the matter rest, though her curiosity burned brighter than ever. She began to suspect that the payments were connected somehow to whatever tragedy had befallen Catherine, perhaps some debt owed to her family, or perhaps something far more complicated. She decided she would wait for the right moment to ask Alistair directly, rather than continuing to gather scraps of information from frightened servants who clearly wished to protect their master from further sorrow. That evening, an unexpected illness struck Eleanor, a sudden fever that left her weak and shivering in her bed. Lucy summoned the estate physician, a kind older man named Dr. Whitfield, who examined her carefully and prescribed rest, warm broth, and cool cloths for her forehead. Word of her illness spread quickly through the house, and to Eleanor's great surprise, It was Alistair himself who appeared at her door that night, his expression unreadable, a small tray of tea balanced carefully in his hands. "I heard you were unwell," he said, standing awkwardly near the doorway, as though unsure whether he was welcome to enter. "You may come in," Eleanor said, her voice hoarse from the fever. "I promise I will not ask anything of you that you cannot give." He stepped inside and set the tray down on the small table beside her bed. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching her, with an expression that seemed almost pained, as though her illness reminded him of something he did not wish to remember. "Thank you for the tea," Eleanor said softly. "It is nothing," he replied, though his voice lacked its usual coldness. "I would not wish illness upon anyone in this house, whatever else stands between us." He turned to leave, but paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. "Rest well, Eleanor," he said, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with her tea and her racing thoughts. It was such a small gesture, a simple tray of tea brought by a man who had sworn he had no warmth left to give, but it meant more to Eleanor than any grand declaration could have. She sipped the tea slowly, feeling its warmth spread through her chest, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to hope that the fortress around Alistair's heart might have a crack somewhere, small and hidden, but real. Over the following days, as her fever broke and her strength returned, Eleanor noticed small changes in Alistair's behavior. He began joining her for breakfast, something he had never done before, and though their conversations remained brief and careful, they were no longer entirely silent. He asked about her recovery. She asked about the estate's tenant farmers, sharing what she had learned from the ledgers. Slowly, carefully, they began to build something that resembled the beginnings of a partnership, even if it remained far from anything like affection. One morning, while walking through the library, Eleanor discovered a book left open on a small reading table near the window, a collection of poetry she had mentioned enjoying during one of their breakfast conversations. She had not left it there herself, and she was fairly certain none of the servants would have known to place it in such a spot. She realized, with quiet surprise, that Alistair must have left it for her, a small gift offered without explanation, exactly the kind of gesture a man too guarded to speak his feelings aloud might use instead. She did not mention the book to him directly, sensing that acknowledging it might embarrass him or cause him to retreat further behind his walls. Instead, she simply read it, enjoying each poem, and left it exactly where she had found it, hoping he would understand that his gift had been received and appreciated. Word soon reached Ashcombe Hall that Edmund Vale would be returning, this time for an extended visit, staying as a guest in the house for several weeks while he conducted what he described as important business regarding a shared property boundary between his estate and the Duke's. Eleanor watched Alistair's reaction to this news carefully, noting the way his shoulders tensed and his jaw set firm, as though bracing himself for a battle he had fought many times before. Eleanor finally asked one evening, deciding that the question could no longer wait. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in the hearth between them. "He was Catherine's cousin," he said finally, his voice low, "and he has never forgiven me for what happened to her." "What did happen to her?" Eleanor asked gently, careful to keep any pressure out of her voice. Alistair's hands tightened around the arms of his chair. "I cannot speak of it yet," he said. "Please do not ask me again, not until I am ready. I promise you, Eleanor, I will tell you the truth eventually, but not tonight." She nodded, respecting his request, though her mind spun with new questions about Edmund Vale and the grudge he seemed to carry so openly against her husband. She began to sense that whatever tragedy had befallen Catherine Ashford, it was far more complicated than a simple accident or illness, and that Edmund Vale's presence in the house would bring old wounds bubbling back to the surface. When Edmund Vale arrived for his extended stay, Eleanor found herself observing him closely during shared meals and evening gatherings. He was charming in a way that seemed almost too polished, his compliments smooth and his smiles never quite reaching his eyes. He spoke often of Catherine, weaving her name into conversations in ways that seemed designed specifically to unsettle Alistair, watching for a reaction each time, with the careful attention of a hunter observing wounded prey. "You must miss her terribly," Edmund said one evening at dinner, addressing Alistair directly while glancing sideways at Eleanor. "Catherine was such a bright soul. It seems almost cruel that fate replaced her so quickly with another bride." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with anger at the deliberate cruelty hidden inside his words, but she kept her composure, recognizing that any reaction would only please him further. "Fate did not replace anyone, Mr. Vale," she said calmly. "I am not here to erase anyone's memory. I am simply here to live my own life, as best I can, in the circumstances given to me." Edmund raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her boldness, but said nothing further on the matter, turning the conversation instead to the property boundary he claimed had brought him to Ashcombe Hall. Later that night, Eleanor found Alistair standing alone in the hallway outside her chamber, his expression troubled. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you said at dinner." "I only spoke the truth," Eleanor replied, "though I confess, I do not yet understand why Mr. Vale carries such anger toward you." "He blames me for Catherine's death," Alistair said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And perhaps he is right too." Before Eleanor could respond, he turned and walked away down the hallway, leaving her once again with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that the truth, whatever it was, would soon demand to be spoken. Over the following days, Edmund Vale's true purpose at Ashcombe Hall began to reveal itself. He was not simply visiting to discuss a boundary dispute. He was gathering information, speaking privately with old servants, reviewing old estate documents, searching for something specific that he refused to name directly. Eleanor noticed him one afternoon in the estate's private study, examining papers he had no clear right to touch, and when she asked what he was looking for, he simply smiled and changed the subject. She began to worry that whatever Edmund Vale sought, it might not simply be closure over his cousin's death, but something far more dangerous, a piece of evidence, or a secret, that could threaten the entire Renwick family name, and by extension, the fragile new life Eleanor was building for herself within these walls. A week into Edmund Vale's stay, Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices coming from the study below her chamber. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and crept down the staircase, following the sound until she stood just outside the study door, listening carefully to the argument taking place within. "You will not find what you are looking for here," Alistair's voice said, tight with restrained anger. "I have told you the truth already, though you refuse to accept it." "Your truth," Edmund replied, his tone dripping with contempt, "conveniently absolves you of any responsibility. But I have spoken with people who remember that night differently than you do, Alistair. People who remember the argument between you and Catherine, the one that sent her running out into the storm." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. A storm. An argument. Pieces of the puzzle she had been slowly assembling suddenly shifted into a new and troubling shape. "I did not force her out into that storm," Alistair said, his voice cracking slightly. "She chose to leave. I begged her to stay. And yet she died, and you lived," Edmund said coldly. "Convenient, is it not?" Eleanor could not bear to listen any longer. She retreated quietly back up the staircase, her mind racing with new questions and a growing dread about what truth might eventually surface from beneath the careful silence of Ashcombe Hall. At breakfast that morning, Alistair looked exhausted, dark circles beneath his eyes, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted his teacup. Edmund did not join them, having apparently left the house early, for reasons unknown. Eleanor decided this was the moment to finally speak plainly. "I heard part of your argument with Mr. Vale this morning," she admitted. "I did not mean to eavesdrop, but I could not help overhearing." Alistair's shoulders tensed, but he did not deny her words or ask her to leave the room. "Then you know more than you did before," he said quietly. "I know there was a storm," Eleanor said gently, "and an argument, but I do not know the whole truth, Alistair, and I think it is time you trusted me with it, whatever it may be." He was silent for a long moment, staring down at his tea, as though searching for courage within its depths. Finally, he set the cup down and met her eyes directly for the first time in their entire marriage. "3 years ago," he began, his voice low and steady despite the clear pain behind his words, "Catherine and I were to be married within the month. But my family's finances were already collapsing, and I had made a foolish decision to borrow money from a man of poor reputation, hoping to save the estate before our wedding. Catherine discovered the debt, and she feared, rightly, that our marriage would drag her own family's name into scandal and ruin alongside mine. We argued about it the night before a great storm arrived. She wished to end the engagement. I begged her to reconsider, to trust that I could find another way to save the estate without involving her family's fortune. She left the house angry, riding out into the darkening sky despite my pleas for her to stay until morning. Her horse was later found wandering the road alone. She was found the next day, at the bottom of a ravine near the old mill, where the storm had apparently caused her horse to lose its footing on the wet stone. Eleanor's heart ached at the sorrow woven through every word of his confession. "That was not your fault," she said softly. "A storm and a frightened horse are not choices you made." "Perhaps not directly," Alistair said, "but if I had not argued with her that night, if I had simply let her end the engagement without protest, she would never have ridden out into that storm at all. Edmund believes I pressured her to stay engaged despite her wishes, purely to save my family's fortune, and that my selfishness led directly to her death. He is not entirely wrong. He is also not entirely right," Eleanor said firmly. "You did not create the storm. You did not force her horse to stumble on wet stone. Grief has convinced you that you carry more blame than you actually deserve, Alistair. And Edmund's anger, however understandable, has only deepened that false belief within you." Alistair looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something between surprise and gratitude, as though no one had ever offered him this particular kind of comfort, the kind that acknowledged his pain without accepting his self-blame as absolute truth. "Why do you say these things to me?" he asked quietly, "when I have given you so little in return?" "Because it is the truth," Eleanor said simply, "and because grief that goes unchallenged only grows heavier with time. You have carried this weight alone for 3 years, Alistair. I am not asking you to set it down entirely. I understand that some grief never fully disappears, but perhaps you do not have to carry it alone any longer." The payments Eleanor had noticed in the household ledgers, she now realized, must be connected to this same tragedy. Perhaps a debt owed to Catherine's family as some form of quiet restitution, or perhaps money, sent to support Edmund himself, who had lost his cousin and closest companion in such a sudden and terrible way. She did not ask directly, sensing that Alistair had already given her more truth in this single conversation than he had shared with anyone in 3 years, and she did not wish to push further than his heart could bear in a single morning. Over the following days, something shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. Alistair began speaking more freely during their shared meals, sharing small memories of his childhood at Ashcombe Hall, asking Eleanor about her own upbringing and her father's trading business. Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying these conversations, discovering a version of her husband that had been hidden beneath layers of grief and guilt for far too long, a man who possessed a dry sense of humor and a genuine curiosity about the world beyond his estate's borders. Edmund Vale's presence in the house, however, remained a constant source of tension. He continued his quiet investigations, speaking with old tenants and reviewing estate documents, clearly still searching for something specific that would confirm his belief in Alistair's guilt. Eleanor began to suspect that Edmund's grief over Catherine's death had curdled into something darker over the years, a bitterness that fed itself on blame because blame felt easier to bear than simple, senseless loss. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens, Eleanor encountered Edmund alone near the old fountain, his expression thoughtful as he stared at the water. "You seem determined to prove something against my husband," Eleanor said, deciding a direct approach might serve better than continued caution. "I am determined to find the truth," Edmund replied, "something your husband has avoided for 3 years." "He has told me the truth," Eleanor said, "about the argument, about the debt, about the storm. He carries guilt for pressuring her to stay engaged. Guilt he did not need to carry, because a storm and a frightened horse are not choices a person makes deliberately." Edmund's expression flickered with something like surprise, quickly masked behind his usual composed smile. "He told you all of that?" "He did," Eleanor said, "and I believe him. I understand your grief, Mr. Vale. Losing someone you love is a terrible thing, and searching for someone to blame can feel like the only way to make sense of such a senseless loss. But blaming Alistair will not bring Catherine back, and it will not heal your own grief either. It will only keep both of you trapped in the same sorrow for years to come." Edmund said nothing for a long moment, his gaze drifting back to the water. "You are a bold woman, Duchess," he finally said, "bolder than I expected from a merchant's daughter." "I have learned that boldness is often more useful than silence," Eleanor replied, "especially in a house as full of secrets as this one." She left him there by the fountain, uncertain whether her words had reached him at all, but hopeful that perhaps, given enough time, even Edmund Vale's bitterness might begin to soften, just as Alistair's grief had slowly begun to loosen its grip since the night she had first arrived at Ashcombe Hall. Despite the fragile peace that seemed to be settling over Ashcombe Hall, a new threat arrived in the form of a letter delivered early one morning, addressed directly to Alistair, in handwriting neither he nor Eleanor recognized. Cobb brought it to the breakfast table with visible unease, placing it beside the Duke's plate, as though it might be dangerous to hold for too long. Alistair broke the seal, and read the letter in silence, his face growing pale with each line. When he finished, he set it down on the table without a word, his hands trembling slightly. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, unable to hide her concern. He slid the letter across the table to her, and she read it quickly, her stomach tightening with every sentence. The letter claimed to come from a man who had witnessed the night of Catherine's death, someone who had never come forward before, but now threatened to reveal what he had seen unless he was paid a significant sum of money. The letter hinted that what this man had witnessed would prove far more damaging to the Renwick name than the simple story of an argument and a storm. This could be nothing more than a scheme to extract money from a wealthy family, Eleanor said carefully, though her own doubts lingered beneath her words. "Perhaps," Alistair said. "Or perhaps there is truth in it. I was not the only person near the mill that night. Anyone traveling that road during the storm might have seen something. Then we must find out who sent this letter and what they actually witnessed, before assuming the worst," Eleanor said firmly. "Fear serves no one, Alistair. Only facts will help us now." They agreed to hire a discreet investigator from a nearby town, a former constable named Arthur Finch, who had a reputation for handling delicate matters quietly and without gossip. Eleanor insisted on being present for the meetings with Mr. Finch, and to her surprise, Alistair did not object, seeming almost relieved to have a partner in facing this new threat, rather than carrying the burden entirely alone. Mr. Finch began his investigation quietly, speaking with old residents near the mill, reviewing records from the night of the storm, and gradually piecing together a timeline of events. Meanwhile, Edmund Vale's behavior grew increasingly erratic, as news of the letter apparently reached him through the house's ever-active gossip network. He confronted Alistair directly one evening in the study, demanding to know what the letter claimed and whether it confirmed his long-held suspicions. "I do not yet know what it confirms," Alistair said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "But I intend to find out the truth, Edmund, just as you claim to want. If there is more to that night than either of us knew, I wish to uncover it as much as you do." Edmund studied him carefully, searching for any hint of deception, but found none. "Then we are, for once, in agreement," he said grudgingly. Over the following 2 weeks, Mr. Finch's investigation slowly bore fruit. He discovered an old stable hand, long since moved away from the estate, who remembered seeing a second rider on the road that stormy night, someone who had not come forward at the time, out of fear of becoming entangled in a noble family's private tragedy. With careful persuasion and a promise of protection from any consequences, Mr. Finch convinced this witness, a man named Peter Marsh, to travel to Ashcombe Hall and share what he had seen. The meeting took place in the estate's main study, with Alistair, Eleanor, Edmund, and Mr. Finch, all present to hear Peter Marsh's account. The old stable hand seemed nervous but resolute as he began to speak. "I was traveling home that night when the storm hit," Peter said, "and I saw a rider ahead of me on the road, a woman, moving fast despite the rain. I recognized her as Miss Ashford, having seen her pass through the village many times before. As I watched, her horse seemed to spook at something, perhaps a fallen branch or a flash of lightning, and it reared suddenly, throwing her from the saddle before bolting off into the darkness." Eleanor felt Alistair's hand grip the edge of the table beside her, his knuckles white with tension. "Did you see anyone else on the road that night?" Mr. Finch asked. "Anyone who might have caused the horse to spook, or who approached Miss Ashford after her fall?" Peter hesitated for a long moment. "There was another rider, sir, following some distance behind Miss Ashford. I could not see his face clearly through the rain, but I remember his horse was a dark color, and he seemed to be in pursuit of her, rather than simply traveling the same road by chance." "Did this rider stop to help her after she fell?" Eleanor asked, her heart pounding. "No, my lady. He rode past without stopping, as though he had not seen her fall at all, or perhaps did not wish to be seen himself. I was too far behind and too frightened by the storm to approach the scene myself until much later, by which time I found only her riderless horse, and no sign of her at all." The room fell silent as the weight of this new information settled over everyone present. Someone else had been on that road that night. Someone who had apparently been following Catherine, and who had not stopped to help her after her fall. This was no simple story of an argument and a storm. This suggested something far more deliberate, something that pointed toward a truth none of them had considered before. Who else knew Catherine was leaving the estate that night? Eleanor asked, turning to Alistair. He thought carefully, his brow furrowed with the effort of recalling details from 3 painful years earlier. Only the household staff, and Edmund himself, who had visited that same evening before the argument began. All eyes in the room turned toward Edmund Vale, whose face had gone pale with the sudden implication hanging in the air. "You cannot possibly believe I had anything to do with her death," Edmund said, his voice rising with indignation. "I loved my cousin. I would never have harmed her." "No one has accused you of anything yet, Mr. Vale," Mr. Finch said calmly. "But if you were present at the estate that evening, and if you left shortly before Miss Ashford did, it stands to reason that further questions must be asked, if only to eliminate you from suspicion entirely." Edmund's composure cracked slightly under the weight of the room's collective gaze. "I left before the argument even began," he insisted. "I rode home directly, taking the northern road, not the road past the mill where she was found." "Can anyone confirm this?" Eleanor asked gently, sensing that Edmund's fear, whatever its source, deserved at least a measure of patience rather than immediate accusation. "My own household staff can confirm my arrival home that night," Edmund said. "I reached my estate well before the worst of the storm began." Mr. Finch nodded thoughtfully. "Then we shall verify your account, Mr. Vale, as thoroughly as we have verified everything else in this investigation. In the meantime, I believe our next step must be identifying the mysterious rider on the dark horse, whoever he may have been." As the meeting concluded, and the household began to settle for the evening, Eleanor found Alistair standing alone in the hallway, staring out a window into the darkening grounds beyond. "This changes everything," he said quietly, without turning to face her. If someone truly was following her that night, someone who did not stop to help, then her death may not have been a simple accident of storm and misfortune. It may have been something far darker. "We will find the truth," Eleanor said, stepping closer to him. "Whatever it costs, whatever it reveals, we will find it together. You do not have to carry this uncertainty alone any longer, Alistair. Not while I stand beside you." He turned to look at her then, his eyes searching hers for a long, quiet moment, as though seeing her clearly for the very first time. "I do not deserve such loyalty," he said softly. "Not after how I treated you on our wedding night." "Perhaps not," Eleanor said, allowing a small smile to touch her lips despite the gravity of their conversation. "But I have decided to give it to you regardless. Grief has kept you a prisoner for 3 years, Alistair. I do not intend to let fear over this new mystery become another prison for either of us." For the first time since their wedding day, Alistair reached out and gently took her hand in his fingers no longer cold and distant, but warm and searching, as though finally allowing himself to accept the comfort she had been quietly offering him since the very first night of their marriage. In the days that followed Peter Marsh's revelation, Ashcombe Hall settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that follows a shock before the next wave of trouble arrives. Mr. Finch continued his investigation with renewed determination, focusing now on identifying the mysterious rider who had followed Catherine Ashford into the storm 3 years earlier. He traveled to neighboring villages, questioned old stable owners about horses matching the description Peter Marsh had given, and slowly began to narrow his search toward a small circle of possibilities. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself growing closer to Alistair with each passing day, their shared purpose in uncovering the truth about Catherine's death forging a bond neither of them had expected on their wedding night. They spent long evenings together in the study, reviewing Mr. Finch's reports, discussing possible suspects, and slowly building the kind of partnership that Eleanor had once hoped for but had believed impossible after Alistair's cold rejection. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Alistair finally asked the question that had clearly been weighing on him for some time. "Why did you stay?" he asked quietly. "After everything I said to you on our wedding night, after the coldness I showed you for so many weeks afterward, why did you choose to remain here, to help me, to offer me kindness I had done nothing to earn?" Eleanor considered her answer carefully before speaking. "I stayed because I believe people are rarely as simple as their worst moments suggest," she said. Your coldness on our wedding night came from grief, not cruelty. I understood that even then, though I did not yet know the full story behind it. I am not asking you to forget Catherine, Alistair. I would never ask that of you, nor would I want you to. I am only asking you to let yourself breathe again, to let yourself live, even while carrying her memory with you. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. No one has ever spoken to me that way before, he finally said. Everyone else in my life either avoided the subject of Catherine entirely, as though pretending she never existed might ease my grief, or they blamed me openly, as Edmund has done, believing that punishment might somehow balance the scales of what happened. You are the first person to offer me a path forward that does not require forgetting or suffering endlessly. Grief locked away only calcifies, Eleanor said softly, echoing a thought she had turned over many times in her own mind since arriving at Ashcombe Hall. It does not disappear simply because we refuse to speak of it. It only grows harder, more brittle, until it eventually cracks in ways we cannot control. I would rather help you carry it gently than watch you carry it alone, until it breaks you entirely. Something shifted in Alistair's expression as her words settled over him, a softness Eleanor had never seen on his face before, not even during their quietest, most peaceful breakfast conversations. He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand, holding it gently, as though it were something precious he had only just discovered. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he seemed to be struggling to name, "for seeing me clearly, even when I gave you so little reason to look closely at all." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, the fire crackling softly between them, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since her wedding day, that the marriage she had entered so hopefully might yet become something real, something built on honesty and understanding, rather than obligation and distance. Their quiet peace was interrupted the following morning by an urgent message from Mr. Finch, requesting an immediate meeting at the estate. When he arrived, his expression grave, he brought with him a piece of information that changed the shape of their entire investigation. "I have identified the owner of a dark horse matching Peter Marsh's description," Mr. Finch said, spreading a small collection of documents across the study table. A stable owner in the neighboring village confirmed that a man named Harold Sinclair, a moneylender with a reputation for aggressive collection practices, owned such a horse 3 years ago, and was known to travel the roads near the mill regularly during that period. "A moneylender," Alistair repeated slowly, his face draining of color. "Harold Sinclair was the man I borrowed money from before Catherine's death, the debt that led to our argument in the first place." Eleanor's stomach tightened with sudden understanding. "You believe he followed her that night to intimidate her, or perhaps to pressure her into convincing you to repay the debt more quickly?" "It is possible," Mr. Finch said carefully. "Moneylenders of his reputation often used intimidation tactics against the families of their debtors, hoping to speed up repayment through pressure applied wherever it might prove most effective. If Miss Ashford discovered the debt and threatened to end the engagement, thereby removing any guarantee of repayment through the marriage, Sinclair may have decided to confront her directly, hoping to convince her to reconsider." "Is Harold Sinclair still alive?" Eleanor asked. "Could we speak with him directly and learn the truth of what happened that night?" "He is alive," Mr. Finch confirmed, "though he has since retired from moneylending and lives quietly in a town some distance from here. I believe a direct conversation, conducted carefully, might indeed reveal the truth we seek." Alistair agreed immediately to travel to speak with Sinclair, and Eleanor insisted on accompanying him, unwilling to let him face this potentially painful confrontation alone. They departed the following morning, accompanied by Mr. Finch, leaving Ashcombe Hall in the capable hands of Mrs. Pruitt and Cobb for the duration of their journey. The journey took the better part of 2 days, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the extended time alone with Alistair, away from the watchful eyes and whispered gossip of the estate's staff. They talked more freely during their travels than they had at any point since their wedding, sharing stories from their childhoods, discussing their hopes for the estate's future, and slowly discovering the kind of easy companionship that Eleanor had once believed impossible between them. When they finally arrived at Harold Sinclair's modest home on the outskirts of a quiet market town, they found a frail, elderly man who seemed surprised but not entirely shocked by their visit. "I wondered if this day might come eventually," Sinclair said, inviting them into his small sitting room with visible reluctance. "I suppose you have come about Miss Ashford." You admit to knowing something about her death then, Alistair said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Sinclair sighed heavily, his weathered hands folding in his lap. I did follow her that night, he admitted. I had grown impatient, waiting for repayment of your debt, Your Grace. And when I learned that Miss Ashford intended to end your engagement, thereby removing any guarantee I might see my money returned, I decided to speak with her directly, hoping to convince her that ending the engagement would only harm both families involved. And did you speak with her? Eleanor asked, gently, sensing that pushing too hard might cause the old man to retreat into silence. I attempted to, Sinclair said. I caught up with her on the road near the mill, calling out for her to stop and speak with me. She was frightened, riding fast through the storm already, and my sudden appearance startled her horse further. The animal reared and threw her, before I could reach her side. I dismounted immediately and rushed to help, but she had already struck her head against the stone path near the ravine's edge. I could see immediately that she was beyond any help I could offer. Why did you not report this to anyone? Alistair asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and anger. Why did you allow me to believe, for 3 years, that I alone bore responsibility for her death? I was afraid, Sinclair admitted, his eyes downcast with shame. I feared that admitting my presence on that road, admitting that I had frightened her horse through my own pursuit, would result in accusations of far worse crimes than simple money lending. I fled the scene that night, and I have carried the guilt of my silence every day since, though I lacked the courage to come forward and correct the record. Eleanor watched Alistair carefully, gauging his reaction to this painful but crucial revelation. She saw grief there, certainly, but also something else, something that looked almost like relief, as though a weight he had carried for 3 years had finally, partially, been lifted from his shoulders. You did not kill her, Alistair said slowly, as though testing the truth of these words for the first time. Her death was a tragic accident, caused by a storm, a frightened horse, and your own foolish attempt to protect your investment. But I did not force her out into that storm. I did not chase her down that road myself. No, Your Grace, Sinclair said quietly, you did not. The journey back to Ashcombe Hall felt different from the journey there. The weight of uncertainty replaced by a difficult but clarifying truth. Alistair remained quiet for much of the trip, processing this new understanding of the night that had shaped 3 years of his life. But Eleanor sensed a subtle lightness beginning to settle over him, as though the fortress of guilt he had built around his heart had finally begun to crumble under the weight of simple, honest truth. Word of Harold Sinclair's confession traveled ahead of them somehow, reaching Ashcombe Hall before Alistair and Eleanor had even completed their journey home. Mr. Finch had sent a rider ahead with the details, believing it wise to prepare the household for whatever reaction might follow such news. When they arrived back at the estate, they found Edmund Vale waiting in the main hall, his expression a complicated mixture of shock, grief, and something that looked almost like disappointment, as though he had built so much of his identity around blaming Alistair that the removal of that blame left him uncertain of his own footing. I received Mr. Finch's letter, Edmund said, his voice unusually quiet, about Sinclair's confession. Then you know the truth now, Alistair said, standing tall despite the exhaustion of their journey. I did not force Catherine out into that storm through cruelty or selfishness. She left because of an argument about a debt, yes, but her death came from a frightened horse and an old moneylender's foolish pursuit, not from anything I did directly. Edmund's hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment, Eleanor feared he might refuse to accept this new understanding entirely, clinging instead to the comfortable certainty of blame he had carried for 3 years. But slowly, something in his posture softened, his shoulders dropping as though a great weight had finally been set down. I have hated you for 3 years, Edmund admitted, his voice cracking slightly. I needed someone to blame for her death, someone real and present, rather than accepting that sometimes terrible things happen simply because of chance and bad fortune. You were the easiest target for that blame, Alistair, and I clung to it because the alternative, that Catherine's death was simply a senseless accident with no one truly responsible, felt unbearable to accept. I understand that feeling better than most, Alistair said gently. I have blamed myself for the very same reason these past 3 years. It is easier, in some strange way, to carry guilt than to accept that some losses simply happen without reason or fairness attached to them. Edmund nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. What happens now? He asked. Sinclair's confession, if made public, could bring scandal upon multiple families, including my own, given my cousin's connection to this entire affair. We must decide together how to proceed, Eleanor said, stepping forward to join the conversation. Perhaps the full truth need not become public gossip. Perhaps it is enough that those who need to know, those who have carried guilt or blame these past 3 years, finally understand what truly happened. Sinclair has already suffered enough guilt of his own, and further public scandal would serve no one, least of all Catherine's memory. Both men considered her words carefully, and after a long discussion, they agreed to keep the full details private, sharing only enough of the truth with Catherine's immediate family to ease their own uncertain grief, while allowing the wider public story to remain simply that her death had resulted from a tragic accident during a storm, which was, after all, largely true. In the weeks that followed, Edmund Vale's presence at Ashcombe Hall shifted from tension to something resembling cautious friendship. He remained for several more weeks, no longer investigating or accusing, but instead grieving properly, for the first time since Catherine's death, finally able to mourn her loss without the constant fuel of misplaced blame keeping his grief twisted into anger. Eleanor found herself growing genuinely fond of Edmund during this period, discovering beneath his earlier hostility a man who had simply loved his cousin deeply and had not known how to process such a sudden, senseless loss. She spent many afternoons walking the gardens with him, listening to stories of Catherine's childhood, learning about the vibrant, curious young woman whose death had cast such a long shadow over Ashcombe Hall. "She would have liked you," Edmund said one afternoon, as they walked together near the old fountain, where they had first spoken so tensely months earlier. Catherine always admired boldness in others, having possessed a fair amount of it herself. "I wish I could have known her," Eleanor said honestly. "From everything you and Alistair have shared, she sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Edmund agreed, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time since his arrival at the estate. "I am glad, in the end, that Alistair found someone equally remarkable to share his life with now, even if the circumstances of your marriage began under such difficult conditions." Meanwhile, Alistair and Eleanor's own relationship continued to deepen with each passing week. The formal distance that had once characterized their interactions had given way to genuine warmth, shared laughter over small household matters, and long evening conversations that stretched late into the night. Alistair began involving Eleanor directly in estate management decisions, valuing her insight and her natural talent for organization, developed through years of watching her father conduct his own business affairs. "You have a gift for this," Alistair told her one evening, as they reviewed proposed improvements to the tenant farms together. "Far more than I possess myself, if I am honest. I have always found these matters tedious, while you seem to genuinely enjoy the challenge of balancing fairness with practicality. My father always said that a good business decision considers everyone affected by it, not merely the person making the decision," Eleanor replied. "I suppose I learned that lesson well enough to apply it here as well." Their growing partnership did not go unnoticed by the wider society surrounding Ashcombe Hall. Neighboring families began to comment on the change in the Duke's demeanor, noting that the cold, distant man who had married so reluctantly months earlier now seemed to smile more freely, to engage more warmly with those around him, and to speak of his young Duchess with evident respect and growing affection. Rumors began to circulate at social gatherings, whispered behind fans and over shared cups of tea, that the marriage arranged purely for financial convenience had somehow transformed into something resembling genuine partnership, if not yet outright love. Eleanor heard these rumors secondhand through Margaret, who visited Ashcombe Hall for the first time since the wedding, and could hardly contain her curiosity about the obvious changes she observed in both Eleanor and Alistair's behavior toward one another. "You seem happy," Margaret observed, as they walked together through the gardens during her visit. "Truly happy. Not merely putting on a brave face for society's benefit." "I believe I am," Eleanor admitted, somewhat surprised by her own honest answer. "It has not been an easy path, Margaret. There were nights I feared this marriage would remain nothing more than a cold arrangement for the rest of my life. But Alistair is not the man I believed him to be on our wedding night. Grief had simply buried the person he truly is beneath layers of guilt and silence." "And now?" Margaret asked, smiling knowingly. "Now," Eleanor said, feeling warmth spread through her chest as she spoke the words aloud for the first time. "I believe we are building something real between us. something neither obligation nor arrangement created, but something we have chosen together, piece by piece, through patience and honesty. Margaret squeezed her hand affectionately. I am glad, Eleanor. Truly glad. You deserve happiness, after everything you have endured since your wedding day. As autumn settled over Ashcombe Hall, bringing with it the golden light and cooling air of the changing season, Eleanor felt a contentment she had not expected to find within these walls when she first arrived as a nervous young bride many months earlier. But even as this fragile happiness took root, a new challenge loomed on the horizon, one that would test everything she and Alistair had built together, and one that neither of them could have fully anticipated, despite everything they had already overcome. The challenge arrived in the form of a formal letter from a distant relative of Harold Sinclair, a nephew named Gregory Sinclair, who had learned of his uncle's confession and saw in it an opportunity for personal gain, rather than any genuine concern for truth or justice. Gregory arrived at Ashcombe Hall uninvited one autumn afternoon, demanding an audience with the Duke, on a matter he described as being of considerable financial importance. I have come into possession of my uncle's private papers, Gregory announced, once seated in the study with Alistair and Eleanor across from him. Among them, a detailed written account of the events surrounding Miss Ashford's death, written in his own hand shortly before his passing last month. Your uncle has passed away? Eleanor asked, genuinely saddened by this news, despite the complicated history between their families. He has, Gregory confirmed, though his expression showed little grief over the loss. And in reviewing his papers, I discovered this written confession, which contains details considerably more damaging than the version of events you have apparently chosen to keep private. I am prepared to bring this document before the wider public, unless certain financial arrangements can be made to ensure its permanent disappearance. Alistair's expression darkened immediately. You seek to extort us then, using a dead man's private guilt as your weapon. I prefer to think of it as an opportunity for mutual benefit, Gregory replied smoothly. You avoid public scandal. I receive fair compensation for my discretion. Everyone benefits from such an arrangement. What exactly does this document claim that differs from what your uncle told us directly? Eleanor asked, her mind already working through the possible implications of this new threat. Gregory smiled thinly. My uncle's written account suggests that his pursuit of Miss Ashford that night was more deliberate and more aggressive than he admitted to your faces, painting a picture that could easily be interpreted as reckless endangerment leading directly to her death, rather than the accidental tragedy you have apparently agreed to believe. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Alistair, both of them recognizing the danger inherent in this new complication. Even if Gregory's claims about the document's contents were exaggerated or entirely false, the mere threat of public scandal could damage both the Renwick and Ashford family names, dragging up painful memories and inviting exactly the kind of gossip and judgment that Eleanor had hoped to spare everyone involved. We will need to see this document ourselves before agreeing to any arrangement, Alistair said firmly, refusing to be bullied into an immediate decision. Of course, Gregory said, producing a folded paper from his coat and sliding it across the desk. Though I retain the original, safely stored elsewhere, should any attempt be made to simply destroy this copy. Alistair read through the document carefully, his jaw tightening with each line, before passing it to Eleanor. The written account did indeed paint a more troubling picture than Sinclair's verbal confession had suggested, describing his pursuit of Catherine in terms that could easily be twisted to suggest malicious intent, rather than desperate, foolish concern over an unpaid debt. This could ruin more than just our family's reputations, Eleanor said quietly, once she had finished reading. If this becomes public, Catherine's memory itself could be tarnished by endless speculation and gossip, transforming her death from a private tragedy into public entertainment for those who enjoy scandal above all else. What do you propose we do? Alistair asked, turning to her with the same trust he had come to place in her judgment over the preceding months. We must consult Mr. Finch immediately, Eleanor said, and we must speak with Edmund as well, given his own family's connection to this matter. This threat affects more than just the two of us, Alistair. We should not decide our response in isolation. Mr. Finch arrived within the day, his expression grave, as he reviewed the document Gregory had presented. Edmund, too, joined the discussion, his earlier hostility toward Alistair having long since transformed into genuine partnership in protecting both their families' names. This document, even if genuine, proves nothing beyond what your uncle already confessed verbally, Mr. Finch said, after careful examination. It merely uses more dramatic language to describe the same essential events. I do not believe a court of law would find grounds for any criminal accusation based on this account alone, particularly given that Sinclair himself has since passed away and cannot be questioned or prosecuted regardless. But public opinion rarely requires the same standard of proof as a court of law, Edmund observed grimly. Gossip spreads based on suggestion and scandal, not careful legal analysis. Even if this document could never result in formal charges, its public release could still damage both our families considerably. Then we must consider our options carefully, Eleanor said. Paying Gregory's demanded sum would only invite further extortion attempts in the future, once he realizes how easily we can be pressured through threats of scandal. But allowing the document to become public risks exactly the kind of damage Edmund describes. There is a third option, Alistair said slowly, an idea clearly forming as he spoke. We could choose to control the narrative ourselves, rather than allowing Gregory to control it through threat and extortion. If we release the true account of that night publicly, on our own terms, framed honestly and completely, rather than through dramatic exaggeration, we remove Gregory's leverage entirely. There would be nothing left to threaten us with, if the truth were already known. Eleanor considered this proposal carefully, recognizing both its boldness and its risk. It would require considerable courage, she said. Speaking openly about Catherine's death, about the debt, about everything that led to that night, would invite public scrutiny regardless of how honestly we presented it. But it would also finally free all of us, Edmund included, from living under the constant threat of exposure and blackmail. I am willing to take that risk, Alistair said, looking around the room at Eleanor, Edmund, and Mr. Finch in turn. I have hidden behind silence and secrecy for 3 years, and it has brought me nothing but continued pain and vulnerability to exactly this kind of threat. Perhaps it is time to finally step into the light, however difficult that may prove. Edmund nodded slowly, considering the proposal. I confess I have some hesitation, given my own family's connection to this matter, but I agree that continued secrecy only invites continued vulnerability. If we tell the truth ourselves, honestly and completely, perhaps we finally close this chapter for good, rather than leaving it open for men like Gregory Sinclair to exploit indefinitely. Eleanor felt a surge of pride and admiration for the man her husband had become since their wedding day, a man now willing to face public scrutiny, rather than continue hiding behind walls of silence and guilt. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently in support. Then we shall face this together, she said firmly. Whatever consequences follow from telling the truth. Gregory Sinclair's demand for immediate payment was refused the following morning, delivered through a carefully worded letter drafted by Mr. Finch that made clear the family's intention to release the full truth publicly, rather than submit to extortion. Gregory's response arrived swiftly, filled with indignant threats and accusations, but Eleanor and Alistair remained resolute in their decision, understanding that the only way to truly remove his power over them was to remove the secrecy he sought to exploit. Preparing to release the truth publicly required careful planning, and Eleanor threw herself into the task with the same determination and organizational skill she had brought to managing the estate's household affairs. She worked closely with Mr. Finch and a respected local solicitor to draft a careful, honest account of the events surrounding Catherine's death, one that acknowledged Alistair's role in the argument that led to her leaving the estate that stormy night, while also clearly presenting Harold Sinclair's confession regarding his own reckless pursuit and the tragic accident that ultimately caused her death. Edmund contributed his own perspective to the account, adding details about Catherine's character and the depth of grief her death had caused throughout both families, transforming what could have been a purely defensive document into something that honored her memory honestly, rather than simply protecting the Renwick family's reputation. I want people to remember her as she truly was, Edmund said, as they reviewed the final draft together in the study one evening, not merely as a tragic footnote in a scandal, but as the vibrant, intelligent woman she actually was, whose death was a genuine loss to everyone who knew her. We will honor that in this account, Eleanor promised. The truth deserves to include who she was, not merely how she died. Once the document was finalized, they decided the most effective approach would be a small, carefully arranged gathering of the most influential families in the region, where Alistair himself would present the account directly, rather than allowing it to spread through second-hand gossip and speculation. Eleanor helped him prepare for this difficult task, listening as he practiced his words late into the night, offering gentle suggestions when his voice grew too strained with emotion, or when certain phrases seemed to shift blame, rather than simply present facts honestly. "You do not need to sound perfect," Eleanor told him, the night before the gathering was scheduled to take place. "You only need to sound honest. People will respect honesty far more than they will respect a polished performance designed to avoid all criticism." "I am frightened," Alistair admitted, a vulnerability in his voice that Eleanor had rarely heard from him even during their most intimate conversations. "Frightened of how people will judge me. Frightened of how this might affect you and the family name you have now joined through our marriage." "Whatever judgment comes," Eleanor said firmly, taking his hands in hers, "we will face it together. I did not marry a perfect man, Alistair, nor did I expect one. I married a man capable of growth, of honesty, and of genuine care, even if it took time for those qualities to surface from beneath his grief. That is the man I am proud to stand beside tomorrow, regardless of what anyone else may think." The gathering took place in the great hall of Ashcombe Hall, filled with the region's most prominent families, all curious about the unusual invitation that had promised important news regarding the Renwick family's affairs. Alistair stood before them, Eleanor at his side, and Edmund positioned nearby as visible support from the Ashford family itself, lending credibility to the account about to be shared. Alistair spoke clearly and honestly, recounting the events of that stormy night 3 years earlier, without exaggeration or self-pity, acknowledging his own role in the argument that preceded Catherine's departure, while also clearly explaining Harold Sinclair's confession and the tragic accident that ultimately caused her death. He spoke of his own guilt, carried unnecessarily for 3 years, and of the process through which he had come to understand that grief and blame were not always the same thing. The room remained silent throughout his account, the assembled families listening with rapt attention, their expressions shifting from curiosity to genuine sympathy, as the full, honest truth of the tragedy became clear. When Alistair finished speaking, Edmund stepped forward to add his own perspective, confirming the account's accuracy and speaking movingly about his cousin's true character, ensuring that her memory would be honored rather than merely used as fodder for scandal. After the gathering concluded, the response among the assembled families proved far more sympathetic than Eleanor or Alistair had dared to hope. Rather than condemning Alistair for his role in the tragedy, most guests expressed genuine compassion for the burden he had carried silently for so many years, and admiration for the courage required to speak so openly about such a painful chapter of his life. "You have shown remarkable strength today," one elderly matriarch told Alistair as she departed, patting his hand kindly. "Far more strength than most men would possess, choosing truth over the easier path of continued silence." Gregory Sinclair, upon learning that his intended leverage had been rendered entirely useless by the family's own voluntary disclosure, abandoned his extortion attempt entirely, recognizing that no further threat remained available to him. He disappeared from the region shortly afterward, and Eleanor never heard his name mentioned again in connection with Ashcombe Hall or its residents. In the weeks following the gathering, Eleanor noticed a profound change in Alistair's entire demeanor. The weight he had carried for 3 years, the guilt that had shaped every cold word and distant gesture since their wedding night, seemed to have finally lifted, replaced by a lightness and warmth that transformed him almost entirely. He laughed more freely during their shared meals, engaged more openly with the estate's tenant farmers during his morning walks, and began speaking of future plans for Ashcombe Hall, with genuine enthusiasm, rather than the dutiful obligation that had once characterized his approach to estate management. "I feel as though I can finally breathe again," he confessed to Eleanor one evening, as they walked together through the gardens beneath a clear autumn sky. "For 3 years, I existed rather than truly lived, weighed down by guilt I did not even fully understand, until Sinclair's confession revealed the actual truth of that night. You gave me the courage to finally set that burden down, Eleanor, and I do not know how I can ever properly express my gratitude for that gift." "You do not need to express gratitude," Eleanor said softly, taking his arm as they walked. "Watching you finally find peace has been reward enough for whatever small part I played in helping you reach it." Alistair stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her chest. "What began as an arrangement of duty and necessity has become something far different to me now," he said quietly. "I did not expect, on our wedding night, that I would ever come to feel what I feel for you now, Eleanor. But standing here, in this garden, having finally set down the guilt I carried for so long, I find myself grateful beyond measure that fate brought you into my life, even under such difficult circumstances." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth she had hoped for since her very first night at Ashcombe Hall, but had never truly expected to receive. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. "What began as obligation has become something I would choose freely, given the choice all over again." As autumn deepened into the first cold whispers of winter, Ashcombe Hall settled into a new rhythm, one filled with genuine warmth and partnership, rather than the cold distance that had once characterized its halls. But even as this new happiness took root, Eleanor sensed that one final challenge remained before their story could truly reach its conclusion. A challenge that would test whether the love slowly growing between them could withstand the full weight of public scrutiny and personal vulnerability that still lay ahead. The final challenge arrived unexpectedly, in the form of Eleanor's own father, Walter Hale, who traveled to Ashcombe Hall one cold winter morning with troubling news about the very trade arrangements that had originally financed the marriage settlement between their two families. A rival merchant seeking to damage Walter Hale's reputation and steal his most valuable trading contracts had spread false rumors, suggesting that the Hale family's fortune had been built through dishonest means, including claims of smuggled goods and falsified trade documents. "These accusations are entirely false," Walter insisted, sitting across from Alistair and Eleanor in the study, his weathered face lined with worry. "But false accusations, spread widely enough among the merchant community, can destroy a reputation just as effectively as true ones, regardless of their lack of foundation in fact." "Who has spread these rumors?" Alistair asked, his protective instincts toward Eleanor's family clearly engaged despite the relatively short time he had known his father-in-law. "A merchant named Charles Doyle," Walter said. "He has long envied my success in securing the most profitable trading routes, and I believe he now sees an opportunity to damage my reputation, while my family's connection to your noble title makes such an attack particularly newsworthy among certain social circles." Eleanor felt a familiar surge of protective anger rising within her chest. "We must act quickly to counter these false claims," she said, her mind already working through possible strategies. "Silence in the face of such accusations only allows them to spread further and gain false credibility through repetition." "I agree," Alistair said firmly. "Eleanor, your father's reputation is now connected to our family's own standing, given our marriage. This attack against him is, in effect, an attack against Ashcombe Hall as well. We must respond together, using whatever resources and influence we possess to defend the truth." Over the following days, Eleanor worked closely with her father and Alistair to gather evidence disproving Charles Doyle's false claims, reviewing years of legitimate trade documents, gathering testimonials from honest business partners who had worked with Walter Hale for decades, and preparing a clear, factual rebuttal to every accusation Doyle had spread through the merchant community's gossip networks. Alistair, drawing on his own noble connections and social standing, arranged a formal gathering of prominent merchants and noble families alike, where Walter Hale could present his evidence directly and clear his name before the same social circles that had begun to whisper about the scandal. Eleanor stood beside her father throughout the gathering, offering visible support as a duchess now standing firmly behind her own family's honor, a powerful statement that carried considerable weight among the assembled guests. Charles Doyle, upon learning of the gathering and the substantial evidence prepared against his false claims, attempted to avoid the confrontation entirely, sending excuses about prior engagements that prevented his attendance. But Mr. Finch, whom Alistair had once again engaged to assist with this new investigation, had already gathered sufficient proof of Doyle's own deceptive practices, including evidence that he had fabricated the very documents he claimed proved Walter Hale's dishonesty. When this counter-evidence was presented publicly, the tide of opinion shifted swiftly against Doyle himself, and Walter Hale's reputation emerged, not only cleared of all false accusations, but strengthened considerably by the transparent, evidence-based manner in which the truth had been established. Doyle's own business dealings came under increased scrutiny following this public exposure, and within months, his standing among the merchant community had collapsed entirely, a fitting consequence for his attempt to destroy an honest man's reputation through fabricated lies. "Thank you," Walter said to Alistair and Eleanor both, once the matter had been fully resolved. I confess, when I first arranged this marriage between our families, I worried that Eleanor might find herself trapped in a cold, distant arrangement, valued only for the fortune she brought to your estate. I am deeply relieved to see how wrong that fear has proven to be. Eleanor has given me far more than any fortune could measure, Alistair said, glancing warmly at his wife. She has taught me that grief need not remain a prison, that honesty is stronger than silence, and that partnership built on genuine respect can grow into something far more valuable than any arrangement built purely on obligation. Walter smiled, clearly moved by these words, and embraced his daughter warmly, before departing for his return journey home, his own reputation now fully restored and strengthened by the ordeal he had faced. With this final challenge resolved, Ashcombe Hall settled into a period of genuine peace, the kind that Eleanor had once believed impossible when she first arrived as a nervous young bride, facing a husband who had coldly rejected her on their very wedding night. The estate itself flourished under their combined management, tenant farmers reporting improved harvests and fairer treatment, household staff working with genuine warmth rather than the tense caution that had once characterized their service, and neighboring families speaking openly of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe as a model of genuine partnership within noble marriage. One evening, as winter began to give way to the first gentle signs of approaching spring, Alistair asked Eleanor to join him in the old chapel where he had once knelt alone beside Catherine's grave marker, seeking solitude in his grief. This time, however, he did not go alone, and he did not carry the same heavy sorrow that had once driven him to seek comfort in isolation. I wanted to share this place with you properly, he said, as they stood together before the small stone marker, now cleaned and tended with fresh flowers, that Eleanor herself had helped select from the estate's gardens. Not as a place of hidden grief anymore, but as a place where I can honor Catherine's memory openly, alongside the life I am now building with you. Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes, moved deeply by the trust and vulnerability in his words. I am honored that you would share this place with me, she said softly. Catherine will always be a part of your story, Alistair, and I would never wish to erase that. I only hope she would be glad to know that you have finally found peace, and perhaps even happiness, after everything you both endured. Alistair took her hand gently, his eyes glistening with quiet emotion. I believe she would be glad, he said. She was never a woman who wished for others to suffer needlessly, even in her own memory. I think she would want exactly this, for me to live fully, to love again, and to build something genuine and lasting, even while carrying her memory with tenderness rather than guilt. As they stood together in the quiet chapel, the last light of a winter sunset filtering gently through the old stained glass windows, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion settle over her, the culmination of everything she had endured, and everything she had helped Alistair overcome since that first cold night of their marriage. The path had not been easy, filled as it was with grief, threats, false accusations, and painful truths that had needed to be uncovered slowly and carefully. But standing here now, hand in hand with the man who had once refused to be her husband in anything but name, Eleanor understood that everything they had built together had grown from something far stronger than the simple obligation that had first brought them together. Spring arrived at Ashcombe Hall with a warmth that seemed to mirror the transformation that had taken place within its walls over the preceding months. The gardens bloomed with color for the first time in years, tended carefully by staff who now worked with genuine pride in the estate they served, and the tenant farms reported their most successful planting season in over a decade, thanks to the fair and thoughtful management Alistair and Eleanor had brought together to every decision affecting the land and its people. Margaret visited once again during this season of renewal, and this time she brought with her news of her own upcoming engagement, a happy development that gave Eleanor and Alistair reason to host a celebration at Ashcombe Hall, the first joyful gathering the estate had seen in many years. Edmund Vale attended as well, now a welcome and trusted friend, rather than the bitter, suspicious visitor he had once been. His own grief for Catherine finally settled into something gentler, a fond remembrance rather than a consuming wound. I never imagined, when I first arrived here months ago, that I would leave having found genuine friendship within these walls, Edmund said, raising a glass during the celebration's toasts. Alistair, Eleanor, you have both shown me that healing is possible, even after the deepest loss, and that truth, however difficult, is always stronger than the comfortable lies we sometimes tell ourselves to avoid pain. As the celebration continued into the evening, Alistair drew Eleanor aside to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the music and laughter of their guests, wanting a private moment amid the joyful chaos of the gathering. "Do you remember," he asked softly, taking both her hands in his, "what you told me during one of our very first honest conversations, about grief locked away only calcifying over time?" "I remember," Eleanor said, smiling gently at the memory. "I have thought of those words often since that night," Alistair continued. "They changed something within me, Eleanor, more than I think you ever fully realized. I had spent 3 years believing that my grief and guilt were a burden I alone must carry, a punishment I somehow deserved for surviving when Catherine did not. Your words gave me permission, for the first time, to imagine a different path forward, one where grief and love could coexist, rather than grief forever blocking any possibility of love." "I only spoke what I believed to be true," Eleanor said softly. "I never expected those words alone to change everything so completely." "They did more than change my grief," Alistair said, his voice growing more tender. "They opened a door within me that I had believed permanently sealed. Through that door, I found my way back to genuine feeling, genuine connection, and ultimately, to you. What began as a marriage of obligation and financial necessity has become, for me, a partnership I would choose freely and completely, given every choice in the world." Eleanor felt her heart swell with an emotion she had waited many months to hear expressed so openly. "I feel exactly the same," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the depth of her own feeling. "I came to Ashcombe Hall hoping for kindness, and I found instead a husband who could offer me nothing at all. But I chose to stay, to understand, to be patient, because I believed there was a good man hidden beneath that grief, waiting to be found again. I am so grateful, Alistair, that my belief proved true." Alistair reached up and gently touched her cheek, his eyes shining with unmistakable love as he looked at her in the soft evening light. "Eleanor Hale," he said, using her maiden name softly, as though returning to the very beginning of their story. "I did not choose you on our wedding day, not truly, not with my whole heart. But I choose you now, completely and freely, not out of any contract or obligation, but because I love you, and because you have given me back a life I believed was lost forever." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, and she smiled through them, feeling a happiness so complete it seemed to fill every corner of her being. "And I choose you, Alistair Renwick," she replied softly. "Not the cold Duke who rejected me on our wedding night, but the man you have become since, the man who found the courage to face his grief honestly, to seek truth, even when it proved painful, and to open his heart again after believing it could never heal." They stood together in the quiet garden, the sounds of celebration continuing softly in the distance, and Alistair leaned down to kiss her gently, a kiss that held within it all the patience, honesty, and hard-won love that had grown between them since that first difficult night many months earlier. When they finally parted, Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, feeling a peace and contentment she had once feared she might never find within these walls. "What happens now?" she asked softly, though she already sensed the answer within her own heart. "Now," Alistair said, wrapping his arms gently around her, "we simply continue building this life together, one honest day at a time. We have already faced grief, threats, false accusations, and painful truths together, and we have emerged from each challenge stronger and more devoted to one another than before. Whatever the future brings, Eleanor, I believe we are ready to face it side by side, as true partners rather than merely a duke and his obligated bride." As they returned to join their guests, the celebration continuing joyfully around them, Eleanor felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened young bride, who had once stood alone in a cold chamber, rejected on her very wedding night, had grown into a woman capable of patience, courage, and genuine partnership, a woman who had helped heal not only her husband's broken heart, but also the tangled grief and misplaced blame that had haunted an entire family for years. Ashcombe Hall, once a house filled with silence, locked doors, and buried secrets, had become instead a home filled with warmth, honesty, and genuine love, built not through the arrangement that had first brought Alistair and Eleanor together, but through the patient, courageous work they had done together, to understand one another, to face painful truths honestly, and ultimately, to choose each other freely and completely. As the spring evening deepened into night, and the stars began to appear above Ashcombe Hall's ancient stone walls, Alistair and Eleanor stood together among their friends and family, no longer a duke and his refused bride, but true partners, bound by a love that had grown stronger through every hardship they had faced side by side. A love chosen freely, rather than simply obligated by circumstance, and a love that promised to carry them forward into whatever future still lay ahead.